Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 22 January 2024. It is the 295th anniversary of the birth of Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who was born in Kamenz in Saxony on this date in 1729. The well-known historian of ideas, Arthur O. Lovejoy, who was the author of The Great Chain of Being, but in another collection of essays in the history of ideas, he wrote a paper on Enlightenment philosophies of history. And he named Lessing, along with Herder, Kant, and Schiller, as the most prominent 18th century progressive philosophers of history. Quote, a series of eminent German writers between 1780 and 1796 published what may be called progressivist philosophies of history. And these were, of course, intrinsically adverse to most forms of primitivism and implied the rejection of the assumption of the superiority of nature to art, The most important of these writings were Lessing's, and he goes on to name them. So I'm not really sure about throwing all these thinkers into the same basket. There are significant differences between Herder, Kant, Schiller, and Lessing. But they do have something important in common, and that is their reaction against an unarticulated traditional conception of history. Now, while the conception of history is largely unarticulated, the conceptual framework is, of course, been given an elaborate exposition throughout 1,000 years of philosophical and theological work. And in this unarticulated conception of history, history is simply equated with salvation history. And this is, of course, Karl Löwith's example, or his critique of philosophy of history up to the present day, is that what Lovejoy called progressivist philosophy of history, Löwith called bastardizations of Christian eschatology, that makes the progressivist philosophers purely derivative and reactionary. But I think there is a deeper ontological unity of both what we can call the providential philosophers of history and the progressivist philosophers of history. And that is that there is something fundamentally wrong with the world. Of course, what is fundamentally wrong with the world is different with the providential philosophers of history and the progressivist philosophers of history. For the providentialists, man is sinful and fallen, and that makes the world fundamentally flawed, or man at least fundamentally flawed and in need of redemption. For the progressivists, I think the best way to sum up the progressivist conception of what's wrong with the world is Rousseau's famous line that man is born free but is everywhere in chains. So both providential and progressivist philosophers of history recognize that there was something wrong with the world, and when there's something wrong with the world, it needs to be set right. And again, despite the fundamental differences between the providentialist and the progressivist point of view, there is a shared solution to what is wrong with the world, and that shared solution is human freedom. So just as the ontological flaw in the world differs between the providentialists and the progressivists, the human freedom that redeems us differs us in each of those cases. So the traditional pre-modern conception of human freedom is freedom from sin, freedom from temptation, freedom from the bondage of the flesh and of the world. I call this the illiberal conception of freedom. And I found a good expression of it in Isaiah Berlin's book on Vico and Herder, when he is commenting on the Protestant pietists. And he says, quote, above all, their preoccupation with the life of the spirit, which alone liberated men from the bonds of the flesh and nature, unquote. I think Gilbert Murray, who I discussed in a previous episode, would have called the illiberal conception of freedom a retreat from the world and a failure of nerve. And I think a providential philosopher of history would respond that the liberal conception of freedom is a failure of nerve because it's a retreat in the face of the difficulty that is the attainment of spiritual freedom. The idea of spiritual freedom is largely unfamiliar to us today. It even sounds strange to us. But both the illiberal and the liberal conception of freedom are perennial, and they are found in every age in different forms. At the present time, we happen to be at the flood tide of the liberal conception of freedom, and so virtually the only conception of freedom we know today is that derived from the great expressions from the Enlightenment to the present day. And in particular, I would say that the fullest explicit philosophical expression was given to the liberal conception of freedom in the 19th century by John Stuart Mill in his many works, Utilitarianism and Liberty, et cetera, et cetera. Mill wrote, quote, "Over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign," unquote. But before the liberal conception of freedom was given theoretical exposition, it was given expression in literature. And here we find the common presuppositions that unite the progressivist philosophers of history and outweighs their differences. Because like Sartre in the 20th century, who was a philosopher who wrote large books on technical philosophical things, but he also wrote literary criticism, art criticism, and journalistic kind of work. The progressivist philosophers of the 18th century were men of letters, and they wrote plays and journalism for a popular audience. And we can find in their drama the common concern with freedom that we don't find, for example, in medieval mystery plays and the like. But while they give common voice to a concern for freedom, it gets expressed in very different ways. So there are differences nonetheless. Isaiah Berlin, in his book, The Crooked Timber of Humanity, gives us a very interesting contrast between the conception of freedom we find in Lessing's play Minna von Barnhelm and Schiller's play The Robbers. So I will quote, Lessing, in his play Minna von Barnhelm, written in 1768, describes a proud Prussian officer accused of a crime of which he is innocent, who disdains to defend himself and prefers poverty and disgrace to fighting for his rights. He is high-minded, but also headstrong. His pride makes it impossible to stoop to quarrels and with his detractors, and it is his mistress Minna who, by a display of skill, tact, and good sense, manages to rescue him from his condition and cause him to be rehabilitated. Major Tellheim, because of his absurd sense of honor, is represented as heroic but somewhat ridiculous. It is the worldly wisdom of Minna that saves him and returns what might have been a tragic end into an amiable comedy. But Karl Moore in Schiller's The Robbers is the same Tellheim lifted to a great tragic height. He has been betrayed by his unworthy brother, disinherited by his father, and is determined for his own sake that of other victims of injustice to be avenged upon odious hypocritical society, unquote. So even though Lessing and Schiller have formulated different progressive philosophies of history, they both feature freedom. They're both interested in a particular kind of freedom and a particular kind of society, you could even say. Of course, Schiller was already part of the romantic counter-enlightenment that wanted to celebrate a very different aspect of human life than the rationalism of the earlier part of the Enlightenment, which Lessing belongs to. Schiller's rebellious antisocial conception of freedom is still, again, it's perennial. It's still with us and familiar to us, as in films like Rebel Without a Cause and in iconoclasm up to the present day. Lessing's conception of human freedom was centered on education as a liberatory project. Lessing's most famous book is his philosophical book, as opposed to literary work, is translated as The Education of the Human Race, and education is at the center of it. Education was one of the great themes of the Enlightenment. It was a redemptive force, and a cure for all ills. So once again, as Karl Löwith observed, we have a parallelism between the providential philosophers of history who believed in redemption. The Enlightenment philosophers also believed in a redemption, but it was a redemption of reason and the reason acquired through education, you could say. Even a counter-Enlightenment figure like Rousseau, who is as different from Lessing as Lessing is from Schiller, wrote a novel about education, his Emile, which was extremely influential at the time and read by Kant with great attention. There are several anecdotes about Kant staying home from his clockwork walk because he had a new book from Rousseau had arrived in the mail, and he had to read it through. So the idea of the redemptive power of education sounds very familiar because it is something that is still a refrain today, and it just demonstrates the extent to which we are still living in the intellectual world constructed by the Enlightenment. And that means we're still largely captive to the progressive narrative of Enlightenment philosophies of history. But as we've seen, the progressive philosophers of philosophies of history can differ as much as, say, Minna von Barnhelm differs from the robbers, and Lessing's Education of the Human Race differs from Rousseau's Emile. So even though Lessing's conception of freedom is not so rebellious as Schiller's, represented in the robbers, he was still very much a rebel in his time and said things that others were unwilling to say. He was a rationalist of his time, and his rationalism has naturalistic overtones that we recognize today. Lessing wanted to employ reason to overcome what he saw as a benighted tradition, and his method was to employ reason to critique tradition. So he didn't reject tradition outright. That would come later with other thinkers. But he did subject that tradition to a critique, and he introduced distinctions that would go on to become quite influential. So in one of his very short writings, an essay consisting of 11 numbered remarks called On the Origin of Revealed Religion, remark number 5 is, quote, "Out of the religion of nature, which is not capable of universal and uniform practice, it was necessary to construct a positive religion, just as a positive law had to be constructed for the same reason out of natural law," unquote. Lessing thus wants to spare a kind of naive natural religion, even as he critiques revealed religion, which he calls positive religion. And I discussed in my episode on Montesquieu the distinction between positive law and natural law. Positive religion in Lessing is just another human institution like positive law. It has a basis. You could even say it has an ontological basis in the way that the world is, just as positive law is supposed to have a basis in traditional thought, in natural law, which is, again, is based on the way the world is. We get a sense of the philosophical rationalism, his critique, in another short work from 1777, which is now titled On the Proof of the Spirit of Power. Quote, "If no historical truth can be demonstrated, then nothing can be demonstrated by means of historical truth. That is, contingent truths of history can never become the proof of necessary truths of reason," unquote. This is very close to the traditional philosophical idea of the difference between a priori and a posteriori knowledge, and it bears some resemblance to the nomothetic ideographic distinction that we've seen repeatedly in philosophies of history. History, according to Lessing, only gives us contingent truths, and reason gives us necessary truths. And implicit in that is that, and he made it explicit in regard to that history cannot give us necessary truths, but it also seems to follow that reason cannot give us contingent truths. Lessing doesn't follow up on that, but it's implied in his schema. In another passage of the same work, he gives us what I would call reason's operation upon history. So even though reason implicitly cannot give us contingent truths about history, we can use reason as a source of critique of history. And this is how Lessing does it. Quote, What does it mean to consider a historical proposition true or to believe a historical truth? Does it mean anything in the least different from accepting this proposition or this truth as valid? Having no objections to it? Being content if someone else bases another historical proposition or it, or deduces another historical truth from it? Reserving the right to assess other historical things in its light? Does it mean anything in the least different from this? Anything more? Unquote. The obvious question to ask here is, can any tradition stand up to this kind of skeptical interrogation? Because we can see here, I think what Daniel Dennett called the universal acid of reason. Any container you put it in, that universal acid is going to cut its way through, as it were. And this is what rationalism does, and this is why it always makes a mess of every tradition it encounters. And that leaves us with all kinds of problems that we're still dealing with today. So once we free ourselves from the benighted dogmas of positive religion, as Lessing sees them, what is left to fill the void? Lessing is interesting on this point in that he explicitly defended rational speculation on religious mysteries. And this is a quote from his On the Education of the Human Race. Quote, "Let it not be objected that such rational speculations on the mystery of religion are forbidden. The word mystery in early Christian times meant something quite different from what we understand by it now, and the development of revealed truths into truths of reason is absolutely necessary if they are to be of any help to the human race. When they were revealed, of course, they were not truths of reason, but they were revealed in order to become such truths. They were, so to speak, the result of the calculation which the mathematics teacher announces in advance in order to give his pupils some idea of what they are working toward. If the pupils were satisfied with knowing the result in advance, they would never learn to calculate and would frustrate the intention with which the good master gave them a guideline to help them with their work," unquote. That's section 76, by the way. So in Lessing, divine revelation ultimately serves the cause of reason, which we could consider a very optimistic view from the rationalist perspective. In the same work, Lessing gives another optimistic interpretation of violent human history when he makes this remark on heresies. Quote, "It is not true that speculations on these things it is not true that speculations on these things have ever done damage and been disadvantageous to civil society. This reproach should be aimed not at these speculations, but at the folly and tyranny of suppressing them and begrudging them to those who pursued them on their own initiative," unquote. That's section 78. So this and similar passages remind us of the extent to which Lessing Enlightenment thought was a reaction against the Reformation and the religious wars of the previous century. The idea that religious speculation does not harm society would have been regarded to many people as utterly anathema in Lessing's time, but even more so in the previous century. But that showed you, number one, how much history had changed from the 17th to the 18th century, from the Reformation and the religious wars, the 30 Years' War, to the Enlightenment. And it also shows us the different ways in which the tradition would be dealt with by the most advanced thinkers of the time, you could say. There is an excellent 2021 paper by Samuel Stoner, Lessing and the Art of History, in which he places Lessing's philosophy of history in a larger philosophical context. So I'm going to read a longer paragraph from this. Quote, "Lessing's realization that arguments grounded on historical evidence can never shed light on matters of ultimate significance leads him to examine the premises of philosophical rationalism anew in order to discover whether reason can discover truth, how it can discover truth, and what truths it can discover. Thus, At the same time that Kant is writing the Critique of Pure Reason, Lessing too makes a case that reason must undertake a self-critique in order to clarify and justify its own activity. And significantly, Lessing's attempt to carry out this critique of reason ultimately leads him to the conclusion that rational inquiry always takes place in history, and that reason gradually but inexorably works out answers to philosophical problems through history. In this way, Lessing develops an account of reason as fundamentally historical, an account that exercises an important influence on subsequent developments in German philosophy, most significantly on Hegel, whose account of history as a rational process, whose development and consummation are both the condition of philosophical reflection and the highest object of philosophical knowledge, is rooted in, and in an important sense determined by, his reading of Lessing, unquote. So here we can see that Lessing gives a very unique meaning to an apocryphal quote attributed to Thucydides, that history is philosophy teaching by example. So happy birthday to Lessing, and thanks for listening.